Great, thank you all for being here. Welcome to the November edition of Merit Education Rounds 2021. Merit is a community of scientists, educators, and innovators. Our community includes learners from our own Masters of Science in Health Sciences Education program, and we are very grateful for the engagement of all of our learners in these events and those who are particularly passionate about improving the quality of education in the health professions. We're also grateful for the land on which we work and live. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for these lands, which is available to us because of treaties that forever changed the experiences and reality of its first inhabitants. To the Indigenous caretakers of this land, I offer respect and gratitude and commit to work towards equity, transparency, and truth in all that I do. Where I live and work is the region of Peel, part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. The land that McMaster University campus resides on is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. Before moving on to the main event, I would like to point out that this is the last Merit Education Rounds of 2021. And to avoid the risk of rushing some of these announcements at the end, I just wanted to highlight some upcoming events in next year. Of course, you can always go to merit.mcmaster.ca to look up information of our schedule. Thank you, Sam. So first, I'd like to ask you to please save the date for our first speaker of the new year, Dr. Eric Warren from the University of Cincinnati, who will share insights on the use of workplace-based assessment data. This will take place January 25th. Second, we at Merit are very excited to offer this, let's see if I can get this pasted into, a one-day event. Sorry, I had the link. Okay, I'm gonna just share this in the chat. Okay, a one-day event on February 16th, 2022. Registration is live at this link, so please explore the event website and consider submitting an abstract. In collaboration with the McMaster Program for Faculty Development, we designed this event to change the way we think about clinical reasoning and explore ways to conduct research while acknowledging the complexity of healthcare systems and address structures that contribute to health inequity. Finally, please note that on March 24th, make sure you save some space in your calendar to participate in the PSI-sponsored Visiting Scholars event on the power of community, building inclusive networks of research and support. Okay, now that I've sort of primed your interest for the coming year, back to what we're all eager to learn about. So first, a really big thank you to all of you for choosing to spend an hour of your evening with us. Before I introduce the speaker, I'll just remind everyone to stay muted during the presentation. I will help facilitate a Q&A period at the end. But if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat and then I can help curate them and discuss them when we get to the end of the talk. All right, this evening we are pleased to spotlight the recent work of Dr. Deena Hamza, who is an implementation scientist in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta. She has been exploring the implementation of CBME, or competency-based medical education, from the lens of design and innovation principles, looking for the factors that contribute to the longevity of education practices everywhere. You can get a sense of Dr. Hamza's research program from her very recent article published just this month in Academic Medicine. So it's exceptionally exciting that she's agreed to discuss her work just shortly on the heels of that publication, somewhat live in person. So help me welcome Dr. Hamza. The stage is yours.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Sandra, and I'll just pull up my slides here. So I'm quite eager today to, I was telling Sandra earlier that I'm eager to geek out with the team. Some people don't like that term, but I'm quite eager to discuss some of my curiosity about innovations, the longevity of innovations, how we evaluate them, and what I have come to call the ecology of change. But before beginning, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I'm a settler on Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. And as has become a tradition for me, I tend to take presentations as an opportunity for co-learning about Indigenous history. And what I'd like to share with you today is an article that I came across over the summer that was published in Maclean's. And it was about Kyra Flaherty, who's an Inuk woman who's using TikTok to expose inequities up north regarding food prices. And so she goes on in this article to discuss that the food equities are not just about food insecurity, but really it's a form of, if they had food security, it would be a form of suicide prevention. And I thought that was quite an interesting take. And even more interesting is that I just happened to, a couple of weeks ago, go to the Royal Alberta Museum and come across this display called Sausage for PM, or which stands for Prime Minister. What's interesting, this is a display depicting an image from 1966, 55 years ago, that in Edmonton you could buy a pack of sausages for 80 cents. And on the Fox Lake Reserve in northern Alberta, those same sausages cost $2.98. And most residents live with inequities. So the housing security, food insecurity. And the only store for miles around, the Hudson's Bay Company, is overcharging for these sausages. And so these two activists, Stan Daniels and John Sampson, hitchhiked to Ottawa, taking their concerns to the Prime Minister at the time, demanding that the government act. And here we're talking about 55 years later that the same issues continue to exist in Indigenous communities, which really piques my interest about the longevity of innovation. Not that I need more things to pique my interest about it, but that is a perfect example of how are your policies or innovations working or not working. And so there are two words here on this screen, longevity and innovation. Both require defining from my perspective. And so from my perspective, longevity and sustainability are not the same thing. Particularly in my work previous to academia and industry, when we talked about sustainability, it was about resources, and specifically money to pay people to do the work, or money to continue production of something that's tangible. And so it was interesting to come across this review by Moore and colleagues published in 2017, where they were working to develop a comprehensive definition of sustainability. And they reviewed 209 articles and found 24 different definitions of sustainability. But the common thread throughout was that resources, in terms of sustainability, was the common topic. It's about human and financial capital, and that's the perspective of sustainability. And so I needed to conceptualize a new term, or use a new term, to signify that long-lasting change beyond resources, beyond the implementation phases. And so that's why I typically use the word longevity rather than sustainability. In terms of innovation, I know there are many different working definitions of innovation, but from my perspective, an innovation is the introduction of anything that's novel into a context. And it could be something that's mechanical, technological, or a socio-cultural system. Because we're talking about food insecurity, we're talking about what innovations in terms of policies, programs, organizational structures, governance structures were implemented. And so this is my working definition of innovation. While we're on the topic of definitions, let's define implementation science. And this definition is by Eccles and Mittman from 2006. And they define implementation science as the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services and care. And over the past 15 years, this definition has definitely evolved. And not only is implementation science used for, to explore things in health services and care, but outside of that in many fields, including education. And not only that, but implementation science now has multiple identities. And the identity that I align closely with is hybrid effectiveness implementation science. And this is defined as improving the processes of implementation. There's this acknowledgement that if we just improve processes, that doesn't necessarily mean that we improve the outcomes of the change. And in fact, my areas of curiosity are not just about implementation processes and outcomes, but also how the innovation was designed, the components of the design, the processes of the innovation, and subsequent outcomes. And so from my perspective, I don't see implementation, evaluation, and the design of innovation as independent entities. I actually see them as this unique interrelationship that can begin with implementation as an implementation scientist, that then leads into my work in evaluation and subsequent evolution of the design of the innovation. And all of this works in this kind of cyclic synergy to reach the aspirational goals of the change, or what we intend to change. Now we're going to be talking about black boxes, and I think one black box that has yet to be fully opened is implementation strategies. And implementation strategies are the things that we enact, to promote adoption or to implement an innovation, to ensure sustainability. And from my perspective, because sustainability is not the same thing, longevity. Part of the challenge is that we don't really have empirical methods and an evidence base of how we determine those implementation strategies. And so what we're choosing from is from, there's a study here from 2015 where, two prominent implementation scientists, Byron Powell and Thomas Waltz, ran a study, a Delphi study with experts called the Expert Recommendations for Implementing Change, or ERIC project, and uncovered 73 different implementation strategies. But the challenge with these implementation strategies is we don't have an evidence base of what strategies work best for the type of innovation and for the type of context. And so we're choosing these based on perhaps our context or what we're familiar with. And because there are 73 implementation strategies from these authors to choose from, that's a lot of strategies to go through and try and pick and choose. And so Waltz and colleagues started to cluster these 73 implementation strategies into 9 prominent clusters. And those are here on the right, where it's engaging consumers or the end users, using evaluative and iterative strategies, changing infrastructure, adapting and tailoring to the context, developing stakeholder interrelationships, using financial strategies, supporting clinicians or the implementers of the innovation, providing interactive assistance, or training and educating stakeholders. And so what I want you to hold in your mind throughout this presentation is that training and educating stakeholders is one of 9 clusters of 73 implementation strategies that we could potentially enact. Let's dive into evaluating innovation. Unlike implementation strategies and the black box associated with that, the evaluation of innovation has really opened up the black box of evaluation. And so over time, so when we started prior to the 1980s, this is where that black box of evaluation originated. So we had these very controlled environments in which we would test innovations, and we were testing, inputs versus outputs. Did the innovation work? Yes or no? But we didn't actually know how the innovation worked or why it worked. So the processes and context. And often that was because our methods were based on the experimental paradigm or the positivist paradigm that wouldn't capture that information about how and why an innovation worked in a particular context. And so in controlled environments, an innovation may have worked. And then when it's scaled up to and implemented into a context, it didn't work and no one would know why. Beginning in the 1980s was this acknowledgement that we needed to start opening up this black box and taking a look at the processes or what's actually happening in the implementation of an innovation in the context. And so these theory-oriented approaches were developed where it's, if and then statements, what we think will happen and why, which really explored or held space to explore the processes of the implementation as well as the context. And then in the 1990s was this trend toward exploring the fidelity of implementation, because it was identified that you could have an excellent implementation plan, but if it's not implemented well or appropriately or as intended, that could also impact your innovation's outcomes. And more recently, around 2010, there are a couple of authors that have started to talk about the integrity of implementation. And in some circles, integrity of implementation is conceptualized as modifications or adaptations to the innovation. And so this form of evaluation acknowledges that, potentially you could have adaptations and modifications that still align with the implementation goals, maybe not the implementation plan, but subsequent outcomes. But there are challenges with the way that we're currently undertaking evaluation. And the first challenge is that evaluation of innovation implementation is often limited to a proximal lens. And what that means is it's a snapshot in time. And this snapshot in time often occurs when institutional motivation and investment are maximal. So we have lots of resources, money, and human capital invested in it, and people are motivated for the change, but it assumes that the innovation is now static and stable. It also assumes that the change that we see is not irreversible. The second challenge is that innovation is so, whoa, Mark Zuckerberg, what are you doing here? Whoa, innovation is so highly valued that evaluation often focuses exclusively on verifying whether desirable outcomes are achieved. And only 0.2% of innovation studies examine unintended and undesirable outcomes. And so my curiosity is around what will happen within a complex system when the institutional's attentional resources are allocated elsewhere. And just as we discussed, or as I mentioned, that our implementation strategies aren't really necessarily based on evidence or empirical evidence, the conditions under which an innovation devolves to its previous state or deviates problematically or is halted altogether or evolves for long-term change, we don't really have that information. We don't have that that evidence base of those conditions. And so the bridge from implementing an innovation in a context and reaching those aspirational goals continues to be elusive. I always love drawing on the tech industry because they tend to be much bolder about the failures and successes of their innovations. And an example of an innovation that was halted was the Segway. And what was interesting about the Segway is their aspirational goals were to reduce emissions and reduce traffic in an urban setting, and that all of us within the city would be on a Segway, and it never quite met that mark. Ultimately, what happened is you would see it, in mall security. Mall security were riding on it, or it would be like tours where you could rent even within the mall. I think that happened within our mall. And there were many safety issues that came up about the Segway over time. And from the reports about Segway, their responses to those undesirable outcomes were quite slow. And ultimately, when Segway was halted, was here in this photo of a camera person at the Olympics, videotaping the Olympics and running over Usain Bolt with the Segway. So ultimately, it was kind of like, well, there are a lot of issues with the Segway. Maybe we should stop production. Another example of an innovation is Google Glass, and I find this one fascinating. And Google Glass deviated in a way that it didn't meet the mark. It wasn't what Google had intended. And so from the reports, there are two really interesting things about it. The first is that after production, Google had come out and said that it was not an aesthetic design. And I thought that was quite interesting because that was after production. So who did you have at the table that you were asking to provide input about the design and the aesthetics of this Google Glass? The second component that I found was interesting was that they found later on that there were privacy and security issues with this innovation. And again, who did you have at the table? Did you have somebody that's, a lawyer, somebody who specializes in ethics or something along those lines at the table prior to producing it? And their purpose of Google Glass was to target the tech savvy business person. And ultimately it didn't reach that market. That market really didn't invest in it. But where it did deviate to, so it did find a niche market, but that niche market was with surgeons. And that's not to say that they're not, you know, tech savvy, fancy business people, but that is where Google Glass has ended up. And that doesn't meet their aspirational goals, either in the revolutionizing the tech industry or from the profit margin aspect. Another example of an innovation that I'm fascinated by is Netflix. And I don't know if how many people remember this, but at one point, shortly after, I think Blockbuster was transitioning out of commission, I guess, there were these vending machines in supermarkets called Redbox. And I think at one point Netflix may have had something similar, but I remember they were called Redbox, and you could pay for it in the supermarket, get your DVD, and then return it there. And Redbox only had movies, whereas Netflix at the time had a mail order service where you could, through mail, a mail delivery service, where you could order DVDs for videos, TV shows, and video games. So they were quite a comprehensive service. And over time, rather than sticking to what they were already doing, Netflix has now become this streaming service that is in every single person's home. And internationally, there are copy companies that are following in Netflix's footsteps. And so rather than saying, and the alternative is Redbox, which now is obsolete in most areas, that didn't evolve. It stayed the way it was. This was our innovation. This is what it's going to be, and it's now obsolete. Whereas Netflix evolved with our changing socio-cultural, financial, technological contexts. And so I find the tech industry to be fascinating, and I tend to learn a lot from their approach to disseminating what's happened in their innovations. So how do we evaluate the conditions for the longevity of implementation? And so I undertook a critical review with my mentor, Glenn Regehr, and we were specifically looking for frameworks, implementation science frameworks that focus on some form of longevity or long-term change, something that talked about sustainability, the sustainability or value change in people, something that looked at the totality of the change. So it wasn't just about the people doing the work, but there were other aspects such as the inner and outer setting and so on. And so through our identification of these frameworks, we came up with 4 prominent aspects that in some way had to interact, because often in the frameworks that we examined, the shifts between the innovation, the people doing the work, the system, and the aspirational goals occurred in a stage-based process. And we found that to be problematic because, as I mentioned earlier, things don't happen in a linear fashion. And just because there is a shift in the behaviors of individuals, that doesn't even a value change doesn't necessarily mean that it is not reversible. And so one of the great challenges that we found was that we knew that it had to involve the innovation, the people doing the work, the system, and the aspirational goals, but there was no singular model that was attending to these, what we've called the ecology of change. And so we had to develop our own model. And this model is called Econormalization. And we have 2 sets of interactions. And so what we're acknowledging here is that there are grand aspirations that we're working toward. And these grand aspirations interact on a primary level with the innovation, the system, and the people doing the work. And one of the key features of this framework as displayed is that we didn't place the onus predominantly on the people doing the work, which was something that we found in some of the other frameworks that we came across, and also in practice in some of my experiences in design, in tech, in industry, and academia. We tend to put a lot of the onus on the people doing the work. And so we wanted to create a model that reflected that this was a shared change, and the change isn't always on the people. And so the first interaction is between the innovation and the grand aspirations of the change. And so a guiding question is, does the innovation in practice align with the grand aspirations of change. And this is typically where evaluation of innovation starts and stops. Like, are we meeting our goals in this implementation? Yes, no, how, why, and that's where it starts and ends. But there are other questions that we need to take a look at. For example, if we're looking for long-term or long-lasting change, well, do the grand aspirations of the change align with stakeholders' local aspirations? Because if they're too far removed, for example, we want food security as our grand aspiration, and the local aspiration is ensuring that, you know, individuals have, I don't know, proper access to care, for example. And that's their local aspiration. Thinking of those ground aspirations is too far removed from what they can do in practice. Another guiding question is about the system and the interaction between the system and the grand aspirations. So does the system and its structures align with the grand aspirations of change? And sometimes we find that those two things are actually in conflict with one another, or there are competing priorities. Now, the second set of interactions that we have here are how the innovation and the people doing the work within the grand aspirations of change interact with one another. And so a guiding question is, does the innovation evoke meaning to actions and agency of the people doing the work that will lead to the aspirations of change? So what we're really getting at here, is there a value conflict? So the people doing the work, is there a value conflict between what the innovation is asking them to do and their own values? If we look at the interactions between the innovation and the system, does the innovation interact with the system in a way that will lead to the aspirations of change? In some cases, there are social norms, values, cultures, structures that are barriers to the innovation being enacted in the way that it's intended, or the way in which it's designed. And often the innovation isn't designed with the system in mind. And so that's another conflict. Taking a look at the system and the people doing the work, does the system support people doing the work that will lead to the aspirations of the change? What are the barriers to the people that are within the system that prevent them from enacting the activities of the innovation? So let's go through an example. And just for merit, I also said this for academic medicine, but you know, when you're a rock star, you come in and you say, this is the best city ever, just for merit. I'm going to share some early findings from a 3-year study that I've been running at the University of Alberta. And it's taking a look at the promissory discourse of competency-based medical education. And one of the things that I was really interested in was the failure to fail phenomenon, and how some of the activities and practices of competency-based medical education, such as the promise of early identification of learners in difficulty, and that this would be accomplished through authentic quality feedback that's provided, or that feedback interaction provided to trainees given by faculty, how that would then change this failure to fail phenomenon and potentially eradicate it altogether. And so the methods that I used for this 3-year study was a reflective interview using cognitive task analysis. And I interviewed both faculty and trainees. And what I had both faculty and trainees do is, at the beginning of our interview, have them walk me through one positive experience in detail with receiving feedback or providing feedback to a learner, and one negative experience. And whether it's positive or negative wasn't necessarily attached to the type of feedback. So in some cases, learners talked about a positive experience receiving critical feedback. So it wasn't the nature of the feedback, it was the experience itself. And I have to say, this was probably one of the hardest studies that I've run, in terms of it being, many had said that it was a cathartic experience for them. But when we're thinking about, we're going to talk about feedback and we're going to talk about those interactions, we don't often think that it will evoke substantial and significant emotion in recalling some experiences. And I'll get into more detail about that in a minute. And so when we go through the typical evaluation, really we're looking at 2 big pieces. And the big piece is the innovation, as I mentioned. Is it working? How and why? And the people doing the work, are they doing what we want them to do? And so if I have these responses from faculty, I'm going to focus on faculty in terms of the findings here. And so if I have these results from faculty where they say, you know, it's just not for my program, competency-based medical education is just not for my program. I just don't have the time. You know, it's not important to document feedback, or through this particular, you know, walking you through this feedback experience, I just, you know, just wasn't important for me to document it. I think the informal conversation is better. And again, this is where evaluation typically starts and stops, is we're talking about the innovation, the practices, and the people who are doing the work. And based on these responses or these primary themes that I'm uncovering through these reflective interviews, you know, my thought is, okay, well, the people doing the work need more education or training. So we often tend to think of faculty development. And so the question is, or do they need more faculty development? Do they need more information to know why it's important to document feedback? Do they need to know how they can fit in feedback within their schedule? Do they have to have more education and training to know why competency-based medical education can work in their program? And so when we dig a little bit deeper, and these are some of the, you know, the deeper conversations that I've had with faculty, in which they had recounted or recalled a traumatic experience with feedback. And based on that traumatic experience with feedback, they've now built this mental model where they want to avoid that interaction with a trainee. They don't want to be put in that situation. And because they don't know how the trainee is going to react in some cases, they just don't want to engage at all. Another interesting couple of themes that came out were about being concerned about consequences. And they were twofold: consequences for faculty and consequences for students. And one of the things that I found interesting was about the value conflict. And we talk about this a lot, I think, when we're talking about competency-based medical education, and how certain programs or certain faculty find it difficult to give a trainee a 5 because the content associated with that reads as, I didn't need to be there. And I do want to say that within my institution, they've now created a modification to that EPA that now in brackets it says, so it says I didn't need to be there, but in brackets, in theory. And based on the interviews that I've had with faculty, that continues to be a value conflict for them. And they perceive it as potentially being or having a consequence associated with saying I didn't need to be there. Another consequence that faculty mention that they fear, whether it's a perceived or actual consequence, is what happens when they provide that authentic feedback to trainees. What happens to that data long term? And so it's not so much of a concern when we're talking about positive or reaffirming or affirming feedback, but it becomes a challenge for faculty based on this study when it's critical feedback or that growth feedback. In other cases, faculty felt, particularly fee-for-service faculty, felt that they were completely at a disadvantage with competency-based medical education with no benefit. And in their case, they had to take on this additional teaching role, and that impacted their income because they're taking away from clinical time to provide support to trainees. Now, when we look at the econormalization model, we see that there are conflicts between the innovation and the people doing the work. And so when we're talking about individuals, and if we were to say you need more faculty development, you know, about the difference between the 4 and the 5 and why you can give the 5, really we're asking people to ignore consequences. Whether they're perceived or actual is something that we would have to explore in detail. But their behavior, whether it's perceived or actual, is the same. The other thing that we're asking them to do is overlook unknowns, because we don't actually know what happens with this learner data long term. And so we're telling them, just overlook that, just give that authentic feedback. Don't worry about that now. And when we look at the interactions between the innovation and the system, we see that there is a culture, often a culture that undervalues teaching and education outputs. and values much more research and grants and incentivizes or rewards that. So there's a conflict between what you're asking of the innovation and what the system rewards and incentivizes. And if we look at the system and the people doing the work, as I mentioned, there are perceived or actual consequences that faculty are reporting. And so there is no structure for us to counter what these concerns are, whether they're myths or they're actual concerns, and how do we provide recommendations for solutions. And so I'm going to go out on a limb here and bring up the hierarchy of needs. We don't often think about this. Like I'm thinking even in my own work and some of the conversations that I have, I feel like it's often the solution is faculty development. But when we're looking at this hierarchy of needs, we see that the people doing the work are seeking some form of safety and security. And what we're telling them is we want faculty development, so we're trying to go to their cognitive needs. Meanwhile, there are these grand aspirations at the top of the pyramid that they're not even at that space yet. And those grand aspirations are often so far removed from the people doing the work. And what we haven't resolved are their basic needs. Their basic needs related to, as I said, safety, security, job security, finances, and so on. So faculty development or system transformation, and that's not to say that faculty development is never a solution. I do think that faculty development is a solution, but I think in certain cases, when we start to broaden our lens and take a look at the ecology of change, there are other things, cascading effects, that need to be attended to, that are related to the innovation and the system, that are not always the onus of the people doing the work. And so when we're thinking about faculty that are sharing with me their traumatic experience with providing feedback and why now they avoid giving feedback, or they give very generic feedback. Imagine if we took a trauma-informed lens or a trauma-informed approach, and we focused on safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, empowerment. And we did that through system-level policies. So what if there were a policy in place that said, through the educational system, if you put a 5, there are no medical legal implications for you. There are no consequences. And if that's not a possibility, what if we said, well, we need to change what the 5 says on the EPAs on the O score. We need to change that. Maybe it's that the trainee is somewhat independent, or I don't know, the terms may need to change. And in terms of ignoring consequences, whether they're perceived or actual, and overlooking the unknowns, we really need system level reassurances. So again, that's policies or documents to reassure the people doing the work, our stakeholders, or we need to change the innovation. And the culture of undervaluing teaching and educational outputs. Again, that's system level recognition about the value of teaching and education, and having similar incentives and rewards just as research outputs and grants and so on. And so really, if we're throwing faculty development at these issues, we're constantly telling people that these are the values of the innovation, and these are the values that you ultimately should have, but we're constantly in a value conflict. And that will hinder the longevity of the change. So again, I don't think faculty development in this case, based on my study, is the answer. And that comes back full circle to what I started with about this black box about our implementation strategies. We just don't have the evidence base. But if we start using a model like econormalization, or start thinking about the ecology of change, we as a profession will work together to build those empirical methods. So as we're thinking about strategies for implementing, and strategies when we identify barriers to successful change, and we're thinking about the longevity of the innovation, we will then have this evidence base. We can make educated decisions about how we enact certain strategies, or how we make recommendations towards solutions for the barriers or challenges that we see. I'm going to bring up one third challenge. There are a lot of challenges with evaluation, don't get me wrong, but here's a third one. And the third one is about competing interests at play and how evaluators often face pressures to restrict evaluation scope and access to findings. And so this leads to, you know, a limited scope, a limited lens of evaluation, what questions are asked, what methods are used, what data is collected to then inform decisions. And so really what we're trying to go for, and this is something that is more on the entire, you know, discipline or field of evaluation that needs attending to. And so what we're trying to aspire to is justice in evaluation, and that's equity. And we want ethics in evaluation. And I have to put a plug here for Revamp's Research and Evaluation and Implementation Science, which is my joint lab with Dr. Deena from the University of Toronto. And many of the things that I've just brought up right now about ethics and evaluation, equity and evaluation, innovation precipitated harm are all projects that are upcoming outputs of our lab. And so if you're interested in collaborating in these types of areas, you have trainees, you have our contact information. And so as I'm saying that there are a lot of issues in evaluation, know that there are teams of individuals that are trying to work towards solutions. And the solutions are better if we have an interdisciplinary and diverse team. So if you're interested, contact us. In the meantime, I think there's a saying, can't change the world in one day, or something along those lines. So moving toward equitable and just implementation and evaluation, I have 3 suggestions. And happy to talk about these suggestions if you have others from your perspective. But my very first is that it's the importance of having an interdisciplinary team, as I mentioned, but not just in evaluation, but in the design and the implementation strategies, and also the evaluation of the innovation. I think having those diverse perspectives are really important because people will catch your blind spots, and that's important early on. I think it's important to focus on the ecology of change, even if you can't evaluate all of it, but you have to be aware of it and plan your evaluation with the awareness and acknowledgement that there is an ecology of change with cascading effects. And the third is to hold explicit space to examine undesirable outcomes. And I specifically use the term undesirable and not unintended, because in my previous work as a clinical researcher, we often said unintended outcomes, but it was still something that was relatively positive, like depression and anxiety symptoms went down. And, you know, an unintended consequence was the relationships with their parents improved. No, we want the undesirable. We have to attend to that. And no innovation is without an undesirable outcome. There's something always there. Now, there's no way that I could be at this spot that I am at without all of the people listed here. And these are only a few. I have so many colleagues and so many collaborators that have challenged my ideas, that have supported my ideas and have really helped me grow. Can't forget my early introduction as a postdoctoral fellow in medical education with Ivy Ondassen and Shelley Ross. My mentors, Glenn Regehr, Lara Varpio, Aliki Thomas, and Lawrence Grierson. My co-PIs on my normalization work, and of course, Betty is, you know, joint lead of our U of T, U of A lab, but Betty Onura, Keith Wycliffe-Jones from U of C, and Anna Oswald from U of A. And all of my colleagues, and I put it here, all of my colleagues that have told it to me straight. I mean, my favorite are those individuals that don't necessarily agree with me and challenge my ideas to help me grow and be better. And with that, I'm always saying, let's collaborate, but that seems to be my catchphrase. I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much for that, Deena. And I think I might be the first one to sign up for collaborating with your lab. A lot of what you said really resonates, I suppose, and sort of mirrors some of the experiences I have. So just I'm waiting to see if any of our audience has questions they'd like to share in the chat, or maybe hard for some of us to see given the spotlight view. I guess if you're going to raise your hand, then I can keep track of that. But what it reminded me of was a lot of, clinicians who get very invested, say, in clinical decision rules or patient safety and guidelines around that. And because it's something they're personally passionate about, they kind of develop this focus around, well, the decision rules, like everyone knows about them, everyone should know about them, and they're immediate and they see what they see is variation in practice in front of them, right? They see their colleagues not applying the decision rules consistently, at least in their mind. It's not consistent because my perspective is they're missing information in the background, but their go-to seems to be, well, my colleagues need more education, right? And
it could be a value conflict that they're not implementing. Or, we often talk about fidelity of implementation, and anything off of fidelity is problematic. But perhaps that's an effective adaptation and modification that we're just not looking at. Yeah. And so that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, and I think what I really found valuable in some of your translation of the material is that just identifying those values and not just focusing on sort of, did it work, what worked, what didn't work, but it's more like, why are they doing it that way, and what outcomes are really just happening. And I think, like you said, just even putting it in that Venn diagram of, you've got the people and the innovations, and we don't take the time to focus in on the values.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think your examples from business make things a little bit more clear and concrete. When I think of something like the Google Glasses, there can be a specific goal and a market, an audience that you're targeting. And I wonder, like in academics, do we ever pause to think of our audience and like our shared goals? What are we all trying to achieve?
And I actually think that's a huge difference between my experiences in tech, for example, or out in industry versus in academia. It's very much, I often say this, where the people in tech or out in industry have the power. Whereas when we're designing things in education, there's someone else that has the power that's then telling the people, this is how it's going to be done. And so I think it's later in the stage where you bring people to the table, but often it's too late because you've already solidified what your innovation is going to look like and you're stuck to it. Or you're too committed to it that you're not acknowledging that it has to evolve over time. And I find that to be fascinating, the differences between the two industries.
Yeah, and just in terms of, I guess, further translation, not that it's always great to simplify things down to little sound bites, but if you were to offer some advice to some of our audience in terms of, how could they, in their own context, identify some of the things they're missing, right? So if there's an education problem they're trying to solve, if they do believe that there's a gap in knowledge that needs to be addressed, and I agree, we're not putting down faculty development. There's a lot of important work.
Yeah, and in some cases that is the appropriate solution.
But how can we sort of go about our own implementation science perspectives for the problems that we're trying to solve? If you have any suggestions or strategies.
So I think the first is identify what your grand aspirations are and how you think they're going to happen. And often that's through like a theory of change or, a program theory. There's a paper that I wrote with Ivy Owen-Dassin and Shelley Ross about that, but just write what your assumptions are and how you think you're going to get there. And through that, map it out in the interactions between the innovation and the people doing the work and test it out. Like maybe you think the innovation, people doing the work in the system, you think the system's fine and you're going to implement this innovation and it's going to work, but then test it. Go out and see, does this innovation actually match, or are there going to be certain barriers that the system is going to, or the people are going to experience through the system? And so as you have your assumptions, as you're building these assumptions of what you think is going to happen and why, build in certain questions about the system, the people doing the work, and the innovation in those interactions. And I think the 6 questions that we have in that framework can act as guidance to start thinking about additional questions associated with the ecology of change. What I will say is that, Betty, I see you're on the call. Betty and I have just put in a large grant to operationalize the econormalization model. We've built an interdisciplinary team. We have diverse contexts in which we are going to be implementing it. We have people from engineering, bioethics, we have psychometricians, we have individuals who focus on developing evaluation platforms online for it to be open access. We have safety and risk management engineers, civil engineers, and so on. And so we've got this interdisciplinary team and we're saying, let's try this out in each of your contexts. And how does it work and how did you operationalize it? So that is a next step that we're working toward, to have this practical tool rather than here are these guiding questions and you kind of go off and determine what next steps or what next questions you have, but rather more practical guidance. So that's in the works.
Deena, thank you. Thank you for your mention. I will just also add that I put in the chat a link to the PIES framework that just got released by Advances yesterday, I think. So,
thanks, Betty.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, we've still got a few more minutes. Maybe if we're just silent, we can encourage some people to speak up and ask some questions. I mean, really the idea of innovations is very generalizable. I was actually preparing some content for a course where within it, I sort of presented the idea of an OSCE. At some point, the OSCE was this huge innovation. Within the context of delivering OSCEs, there were innovations with how standardized clients were, being recruited and implemented. So just the idea of what an innovation is and problem-based learning was this huge innovation. But certainly a lot of confusion as to what that's supposed to represent today.
Yes.
As an education design concept. I do think that PBL is sort of it's sort of ripe for an implementation science approach.
But that's even something that you could look at retrospectively, right? Because PBL has already demonstrated longevity. We know that it's a long-lasting innovation, so that's not our question. Our question now becomes, is it actually meeting those aspirational goals that we had intended in the first place? And then what are those modifications and adaptations and how is it working? Because perhaps it's working in many different ways and it is meeting those goals. And so I'm thinking about that too, Sandra, because I created a research methodology course for residents during the pandemic, and I'm contemplating if it should be de-implemented, which is rare. Like most people don't talk about de-implementation because it's so political. But here I had the evidence base of, what would be appropriate for adult learners and what are these critical ingredients, but there's something there that may not be working. And so I'm going to use this model to see, what is the interaction between what I designed based on the evidence that we have and the outcomes, and obviously talking to the residents and seeing their perspective, and if it should or shouldn't be de-implemented, or if it needs to evolve in some way. Maybe it just needs to be tweaked.
I'm going to give the stage to Dr. Renata Kalki. Or not the stage. Sorry, you don't get the stage. You get to ask a question.
I just get to sit in the chair I've been sitting in all day. I was just this might not be a fair question, but I know a lot of your work has been in CBME. I'm just curious about what your findings have been at the University of Alberta and sort of what you think the eco-related problems are for CBME implementation there. And then the second part is, I'm curious about what your recommendations would be for CBME, either in terms of what else is needed in terms of program evaluation and research, or what is needed in terms of change in the way that we implement it, or in the program itself, I suppose.
So I almost see that as one super huge question that's very related. What am I seeing with competency-based medical education? I think within my institution, I think there are groups of individuals that could potentially feel alienated in the way in which barriers are handled. And just as I had mentioned, some of the barriers that we see, it's the solution isn't faculty development. And if we really want to include those people and encourage their motivation and encourage their contribution to the change, we have to meet them in some way. And I don't think we're meeting everyone. So I don't think it's necessarily what I would call an equitable process. I think the solutions that we come up with to concerns are a very one size fits all. And I see that as a problem. In terms of, and that's not to say that CBME isn't working at the University of Alberta. I think it is working, but my concerns are around focusing only on the dominant groups. Like if this dominant group is making it work and there's this minority group in terms of number, not in terms of characteristics, but this number, I don't believe that that's a group that should be not paid attention to. Does that make sense? So it's a very, equity justice type lens in thinking about that. In terms of what else is needed in terms of, with evaluation, I think we need to look at the totality of the change. I don't think we're looking at that. I think we're looking at things like how many EPAs are completed, how well the quality of the feedback is, but then it again comes back to faculty development rather than identifying why there may be a lack of quality of feedback that's documented. I think we have to consider the well-being of faculty and trainees, and I don't think we pay enough attention to that within this innovation. And I think that there has to be some evolution to the innovation based on research outside of the University of Alberta and also some of the things that I see within my institution. So I hope that kind of gives you a bit of a picture. I think the first thing is we have to focus on the ecology of change, and we have to really start looking at, rather than the people doing the work as passive recipients of what we want them to do, they're individuals that we need to engage as active stakeholders and not in a performative way. We need to do that in a genuine, authentic way. And that means looking at their wellness, what they're able to do. And that's kind of my thinking right now.
Yeah, I love that. I think we also don't always think of like implementers as experts in their own context. Like the experts come from somewhere else and sort of bring the expertise to you, but like in the same way that patients are experts in their own lives, I think
absolutely
like implementers of different kinds have to be experts in their context. So I have so many more questions for you, but I'll give up my stage.
But again, like Renata, another thing is like we need to involve those stakeholders earlier on. Like you can't be set in your ways of this is what the innovation is and this is the package, and then it doesn't work, and then there's a reluctance to change it or evolve it, right? I think that's a problem.
Well, I think we still think of program evaluation as something that happens after you have a program.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, not good.
Yes. Very true.
I'll hand it over to Teresa. I think she had a question.
Thanks,
too.
Renata.
Yeah. Oh no, I was just gonna apologize. I got hung up at a meeting, but I had a lovely chat with you earlier, and I do think that there's a lot of really interesting ways to use this framework, and it really resonated with me that this framework might be kind of like the realist evaluation kind of like framework, and how that kind of possibility kind of took down the road, right? Like you can use that to kind of be realistic in the way that you set up programs. You can be using it as a realistic evaluation process of a program, and then you can map it to actually using that framework that they created, this CMO, context mechanism outcome framework, to conduct reviews. And I was just going to put it out there that that's something that I think, I don't know, I'm still thinking about it from our conversation earlier. So
yeah, I think that's an exciting, yeah, definitely an exciting direction.
Just for the sake of process, I will thank Dr. Hamza for sharing her time and her knowledge with us today, and ask Sam to end the recording.